Bill Maher has said that gay people should be allowed to get married so that they can be just as miserable as the rest of us. And in fact, sociologists such as Dr. Eric Anderson have found that pressures toward monogamy can create hidden risks in relationships, and that when it comes to relationships, one size does not fit all. Relationships come with many different options to consider, and in order to better understand relationships that are liberating, honest, and respectful, we have a panel with us today from Poly Columbus. Neil Wenneman is a professional atheist with the Secular Student Alliance, as well as board chair for Poly Columbus. Misty Taylor is co-secretary of Poly Columbus, and Rich Galanti is a board member of Poly Columbus. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panelists.
Do we have an extra printout of the handouts? We do. Excellent. I'll just use that instead of putting my screen between myself and the audience. So, okay, I feel like I'm segregated from you guys, but well, this is where the video of that, so. Oh, yeah, you guys come on over. So, hello, everybody. As Derek mentioned, my name is Neil Wenneman. Title of this presentation is Polyamory 101. A little bit of a background of myself. As Derek mentioned, I am the board chair for Poly Columbus. I am also our outreach coordinator. In my day job, I'm the development director for the Secular Student Alliance, so I got to come into work on a Saturday. For this particular presentation, I've been poly for about a year. And I blog off on a variety of subjects, including polyamory, at moresensibly.com. That is a reference to Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. The quote, "I don't want to rule the universe, I just think it could be more sensibly organized." And for me, polyamory is a way of more sensibly organizing relationships. I do want to give a fair warning that I am an ENTJ, also known as Destroyer of Worlds. Of relevance for this presentation is I'm going to be focusing a bit more on kind of like the analytical frameworks of polyamory, as opposed to the more kind of emotional relationships aspects of it, for lack of a better word. So as you flip through the slides, it might be a little more, you know, here's a framework, here's a definition, here is an explanation, as opposed to here is necessarily how it plays out in life. Happy to talk about that during the questions and answers, as well as my panelists with their own personal experiences as well. So as Derek mentioned, we have Misty Taylor with us. She's a board member and co-secretary. She's married. I also describe her as hipster poly. She's been doing poly before it was cool. Also I have Rich, also a board member. He's engaged. In fact, his wedding is next Saturday. Yes. So, and he's been ethically non-monogamous for a couple of years. So we're with the organization Poly Columbus, and our mission statement is on the next slide. Anyone who's familiar with the Secular Student Alliance might notice that we cribbed some of the key words from SSA's mission statement and focuses. As far as we empower individuals, we emphasize building community, advocating for the cause of social monogamy, or social acceptance of non-monogamy, as well as broader social acceptance of that. We serve organizations that have similar goals, and what we're doing here today is we do our best to educate ourselves, allied organizations, and the broader community on what it means to be ethically non-monogamous. So for the next slide, with the dartboard, the expectations for this presentation. There is no polyamory pope. There is no official definition of this is what primary means as opposed to secondary, as opposed to polyamory itself. My goal is to get us closer to those targets. And part of what excites me about being involved in organized polyamory is that we get to be part of the conversation of defining what these terms mean and, when necessary, creating additional terms, creating additional ways of thinking about this so that as a community, whether in our own individual group or across the United States or across the world, we can gain a better understanding of these options that are available to us. So we're not going to have Holy Scripture here. We're not going to have, you know, the final authority. But my goal is that everybody who walks out from here is going to have a better understanding. We're going to be a little bit closer to the target, whatever that target may be. So the next slide is entitled, "Your kink is not my kink." This is a phrase that often comes up. Related phrases, "your poly is not my poly." The idea that different people can do different things with their time. The example that I like is My Little Pony. My Little Pony is an animated series that is traditionally associated with feminine interests, but there recently, last several years, there have been a number of people that identify as male and are embracing My Little Pony. They call themselves bronies. And I look at that and I'm like, that is now not how I personally would like to spend my time, but I am sincerely happy that they have found something that they enjoy. Their kink is not my kink. And so, as it is with poly, there's different ways that people will structure their poly relationships. But if we look to the next slide, you can do this wrong. Polyamory is not anything goes. I have a quote from Dan Savage here from The Humanist, where he says, consent is the beginning, the middle, and the end of sexual ethics. If consent is not part of your polyamory, you are doing it wrong. It is okay to have asymmetric relationships where the boundaries of one partner are different from the boundaries that the other partner has. But you absolutely have to consensually negotiate those boundaries as peers. If you're not doing that, I'm going to say that you're doing it wrong. We also have elements of social justice that are percolating into the poly community. One of my partners is a person of color, and she has shared stories with me of individuals who will polyamorously date, people of color, but they won't consider them for primaries. They won't take them to the company, end of year holiday party. They're just someone to have sex with. And I will say, if that's your status on poly, you are doing it wrong. So, next slide, the definition of polyamory. So if we're going to break it down and look at the etymology, poly is Greek from many, and amor is Latin from love. People often complain about the fact that polyamory is combining Greek and Latin roots. And then we tack on a Y from English for having the quality of. So Merriam-Webster defines polyamory as the state or practice of having more than one open romantic relationship at a time. My personal definition, when we look at it as a state of being, is a state of having multiple simultaneous sexual, romantic, and/or long-term relationships. Now, if we go to the second slide on this, we get to actually my preferred definition. This is how I really look at polyamory, is polyamory as a process, being a process by which someone will seek out, consider, define, enter into, and reevaluate relationships based upon mutual consent, mutual respect, and open and direct communication, as well as the possibility of multiple simultaneous sexual, romantic, emotionally intimate, and/or long-term relationships. So, a lot of words there. I came up with this definition because I've had a lot of friends of mine as I was becoming or evaluating poly who are saying, well, I'm monogamous, do you think that I'm doing this wrong? Do you think that polyamory, okay, it's better for you, but do you think it's better for everybody? And my conclusion is I think that this definition of polyamory is better for everyone. Now, you may come to the conclusion that your current monogamous relationship is better than the possibility of opening that relationship up because it's not going to make the other person, your partner, feel comfortable, or you have concerns about it or whatever. But we're looking at it as the possibilities, comparing monogamy to the possibilities of multiple simultaneous relationships. And if you're coming to the conclusion that, hey, my current monogamous relationship is better than what I would expect from that, then I say thumbs up to that. So one of the key insights for me as I was considering polyamory is the book called Opening Up by Tristan Taormino. And we have the cover of that book on the next slide. And if there were a Bible of polyamory, this would be on the short list of the definitive reference. And in this book, Tristan Taormino cites researchers who concluded that there are essentially three axes of emotion, or three different types of drives that we have. A sexual drive, a romantic drive, the desire to obsess over someone, to want to spend as much time with them as possible, to understand who they are, as well as long-term security and contentment. And the insight was that the researcher concluded that these three drives are largely independent of each other. And so when I looked at polyamory, when I looked at the types of relationships that I want to create, I can recognize that one relationship could have a sexual aspect to it, but in another relationship that isn't as emphasized, or in this other relationship we have a romantic aspect but not a long-term aspect. And so being able to divide that up and say, what does this relationship bring? What does this relationship bring? What is it that I can experience in these different relationships? An open question for me is whether there's actually a fourth drive, an emotional reliance, whether that is distinct from romance, whether that is distinct from long-term security. I have one partner that I will spend time with. We have a wonderful sexual connection, and we'll also go out and we'll do romantic, dinners and everything else, and we'll enjoy that. But we recognize we are not emotionally reliant. The way we describe the relationship is fond, but not emotionally reliant. But the key insight here is that there's multiple different ways of relating, and we're not necessarily required to include them all in any given relationship. So, some related terms to polyamory. Oftentimes you'll hear ethical non-monogamy, such as the fact that I've used it several times in this presentation so far. I define ethical non-monogamy as any form of relationship where you have intimate relationships with more than one person with the consent of all involved. Some view this as a synonym to polyamory. Some people view ethical non-monogamy as an umbrella term that encompasses other terms such as open relationships or swinging. So I'm just going to call that out. I don't think we necessarily have a clear consensus on this is the authoritative definition of ethical non-monogamy. In our mission statement, we included alongside polyamory as well as open relationships. Next item is an open relationship. I view an open relationship as a distinct from polyamory because with an open relationship, you're putting the emphasis on the primary relationship, with the other relationships perhaps being flings or people that you're not necessarily as committed to, whereas in the polyamory framework that I'll be walking through in this presentation, you can have multiple very significant relationships at the same time. If we move on to the next definition, a term called swinging. This is essentially having sex with other partners without an emotional attachment. Oftentimes there's some sort of event as the focal point, such as a recurring social meeting or going to Club Princeton. I have there a still from the movie Wedding Crashers, if anybody has seen that. The concept, or they use the joke or the phrase, a stage 5 clinger, where someone's saying, don't ever leave me because I'd find you. And the reason I have that in is I've heard from other individuals that swingers and people that identify as poly don't always get along because the people that swing are like, well, you poly folks, you might form emotional attachments. We don't necessarily want to bring you into this because for us, this is just sex. We have it, cabined to that particular axis. And, you might get, not want to just limit it to that. So recognizing that swinging is distinct from polyamory. Last slide for a related term, BDSM, kink, or fet. BDSM stands for bondage, discipline, sadism, or masochism. As far as kink, generally this involves the consensual exchange of power in determining roles for relating, whether sexually or otherwise. So you sit down and you say, okay, here's how we'd like to do this particular scene, here's how we'd like to relate on an ongoing basis. You're starting as peers, you're negotiating with consent, and then you're ending up in a situation where you're not necessarily peers. Also, people often use kink to describe sexual acts that involve more than 2 people at the same time, or the use of non-traditional stimuli, such as pain or foot worship, that brings about either pleasure or release. The thing that I really want to emphasize with BDSM, kink, or fetish is that this is not something that's limited to the monogamous or to the polyamorous. One of the key things with kink is that it's sexual liberation, and there is a correlation with polyamory and sexual liberation, but it's not necessarily a defining aspect of it. Next slide is another term that's important to know about is metamours. The etymology on this, meta is English for self-referential or at a higher level. Mours is from the old French paramour for illicit lover, which is itself a combination of para and amour for the sake of love. So essentially, a metamour is the lover of your lover, or the partner of your partner. The prevailing term or the leading term in poly is partner. That's usually how people refer to each other. Occasionally people refer to each other as lover or as girlfriend or as any other label. Again, there is no polyamory pope to say that you're using the wrong term, but oftentimes partner is the leading term. Next slide is the polyarchy, dealing with a hierarchy of relationships. A lot of people that are polyamorous are hierarchical. I consider myself extremely hierarchical. I need analytical frameworks to understand what is going on around me. And so people often use the term primary or secondary. So if you're married to someone, generally you refer to that as your primary relationship. For me, a primary relationship is one that is defined by having the long-term drive, that we are either moving towards a long-term commitment or we have a specific plan for that, or that is on the table. If in a relationship we have we're like, we do not anticipate, spending the rest of our lives together and possibly having a joint checking account. There is no long-term drive there. It, by definition, for me, cannot be a primary relationship. Secondary, some people use that for any relationship that is not primary. For me, it is a relationship that is predominantly driven by having an emotionally reliant attachment. Even if there isn't a long-term aspect to it, it is somebody that I will call if something has come up and I need some emotional support on that. Most people that are hierarchical that I've run into only go to primary or secondary. I went ahead, because this is what I do in my free time, I defined out tertiary and quaternary, where a tertiary style relationship or a tertiary relationship is one in which we're essentially friends with benefits. We have a good relationship with each other. When we're in the same area code, we'll get together and catch up over drinks, dinner, and sex. But other than that, we may go months without substantive communication, and that is completely okay. A quaternary relationship is just a way of defining that, okay, we're going to have sex, and maybe we'll get breakfast in the morning, maybe we'll never talk to each other again, and that's okay. The key thing is that's what we've consented to. That's the type of relationship that we want to have, even if that relationship only lasts for the next few hours. Other people that are polyamorous are non-hierarchical. They do not like trying to stack people up and say that you're more important than this person, and here's the order, and they just say you're a partner or you're not a partner. One of my most emotionally intimate partner describes herself as non-hierarchical. There's another term that I occasionally use is anti-hierarchical. I have a friend who says, I don't even have partners. I just have friends. And some of my friends I do different things with, but everybody is just a friend. And so there's different ways that people will view polyamory. Next slide is one of the big questions of jealousy and compersion. So compersion, it's a made-up word, like every word, and it is the antithesis of jealousy. It's the happiness that you derive from knowing that your partner is having wonderful experiences with others. And one of the key epiphanies that I had as I was determining whether or not to become polyamorous or not is I realized that any partner that I had is most likely going to have had other partners before me, and statistically speaking will probably have other partners after me. So why does it matter if my partner has other partners at the same time as me? And the conclusion I came to is that it mattered for two primary reasons. One is the risk of sexually transmitted infection, and the second is the opportunity cost of spending time in person. If my partner is spending time with somebody else, then she, I'll use gendered language because I'm only attracted to women, she is most likely not going to be spending time with me at the same time, and if she is, it's going to be of a different dynamic than if we were spending time by ourselves. So long as I could control for those two circumstances, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation, then it's increasing the net happiness for her to have other partners, for her to get to have other wonderful experiences. And so that's the idea behind compersion, is feeling happy that somebody else is having wonderful experiences. Getting to the next slide, the fundamental thesis of poly. This is the big one for me that is why I decided to become polyamorous. So I take as axiomatic that the highest good is maximizing the happiness of conscious creatures. If we don't agree on that, or maybe with some wordsmithing we don't agree on that, we're not going to get much further together, and that's okay. But I take happiness as the highest good, happiness or well-being or similar words. And I concluded that adopting polyamory results in an increase in happiness greater than the transaction costs of polyamory. There is stuff that I have to deal with now that I did not have to deal with when I was a serial monogamous. But I concluded on the front end, and I can say with experience, that I am much happier with poly, even given the transaction costs. So what poly does as far as increasing happiness is it allows you to have more relationships that are themselves more satisfying. It allows you to have relationships that would be unsustainable under traditional expectations. I currently have 3 partners, none of them live in central Ohio. And so under traditional expectations that this is the only person that you're going to see and this is the boundary on that, I probably would not have brought in at least 2 of those relationships and possibly the 3rd. But poly allows me to say, yes, these are wonderful, these are going to increase my happiness, enrich my life, enrich the lives of my partners, and it also allows me to possibly find somebody else to become a roommate with a joint checking account on later on in life. So for me, that's an increase in net happiness. It also allows you to have relationships that both parties intend to be shorter term, that you have a conversation on the front end and say, we just want this to be very casual. We just want this to be For tonight, let's get breakfast in the morning. We'll talk about where it is we want to go, but that is the expectation we set on the front end. It also helps with a dating pool self-selection. There's a much smaller dating pool, because I'm somebody who's not currently married, and so I'm actively dating. There is a much smaller pool of people that say, yes, I am willing or I am excited to be with somebody who is polyamorous. I am writing off a relatively large section of the population. But the people that are still within the pool tend to self-select for communication skills and other traits that I find highly desirable. And essentially, I'm creating a smaller pool of more awesome people, is what it comes down to for me. If we flip over to the next slide, something that I really appreciate about poly, especially if you're in a position where you're actively dating, is this concept of the UNIX rule of repair, which says when you must fail, fail noisily and as soon as possible. So if I'm meeting somebody, on OkCupid or at a conference or whatever, we're going to have a conversation very early in to say, is this going to work? Do our needs, interests, and priorities line up? And if they don't, that's okay. But we're going to figure that out, and we're going to decide, yeah, let's move forward with this, and we think this is going to work, or no, let's go ahead and hold off. And so that is something that when I was monogamous, I had a really hard time with. How do you get out on the table and say, I like you, let's date or whatever? Whereas with poly, it's okay, let's confront that early. And if we decide that it's not going to work out, that's a good thing. And it's very liberating to have that sort of feeling. So, getting back to the fundamental thesis of poly, adopting poly will result in an increase in happiness greater than the transaction costs. So, something else that I found about poly is that these transaction costs actually develop very valuable life skills. Because if you're feeling jealous, you need to be able to say that. You need to be able to say, this doesn't make me comfortable. Or, I'm feeling this way, but I think something else. Let's talk through it. Let's figure this out. It also requires you to recognize risk tolerances and talk about safer sex practices. If you are not comfortable talking about condoms, talking about risk for STI infection, then you probably should not do poly, because you have to be able to talk about this stuff with your partners. And you also have to be able to do scheduling and time management. So, looking at these each in turn. So, with jealousy, again, I mentioned the epiphany that I had that the only thing that really changes for me with the fact of having concurrent partners is risk tolerance for STIs and time management. A lot of people have a real strong feeling of jealousy. They don't move immediately into compersion, whereas for me it was kind of an analytical decision. This is just how I personally am made up. Other people are different. The point that I really want to make on jealousy is that jealousy is not a problem that is unique to polyamory. I was married for 5 years, and there were issues with jealousy because people are still going to be attracted to others. You're still going to have emotionally intimate friendships that might cause the other person to scratch their head. At least with polyamory, with this definitionist process where open and direct communication is part of it, you're going to put that on the table. And you're going to be comfortable talking about it so that you can figure out, okay, is there something that I can do? Is there a boundary that I can put on this to have my other partner feel respected and comfortable with it? So polyamory as a process provides you tools for working through that, or at the very least managing it. As to safer sex practices, an important term is the concept of fluid bonded. And fluid bonded is essentially where everybody is getting checked for STIs, and within that relationship, or perhaps within that geometry, if you have multiple partners that are all simultaneously relating to each other, you do not use condoms or other barriers within that relationship. With other partners, if you have other partners, you may require barriers or other practices. But this is something that you usually work to over time. It's critically important to have a regular schedule for STI screenings and stick to it. I am extraordinarily needle phobic, and I have an STI screen on Tuesday. It is freaking me out right now as I'm thinking about it. But I realize this is something that I have to do. It was nice, when I was married, when, okay, this is our only partner and we're not going to be with anybody else and we don't need to worry about all that stuff. This is the transaction cost for me. But it's worth it. You also have to have trust that you're receiving appropriate disclosure from your other partners. If you don't have that trust, you need to work to rebuild that trust or say this relationship is not going to work out. You have to be willing to have a frank discussion of risk tolerance. If not, poly probably is not going to work out well for you. Next up is time management. Google Calendar, I don't believe in gods, but Google Calendar is a godsend. You have to be able to talk about, this is the amount of time that we need, this is time when you're unavailable or off-grid or otherwise figuring that out. It's relatively easy for me because all of my partners in the moment are long distance, so that when we're in the same city, we tend to give that relationship priority over other relationships. But if you're living in the same city with multiple partners, you've got to figure this out. A friend of mine had a relationship that she was really excited about, really enjoying it, but the other person canceled like 3 times on her with little or no notice, and she's like, I'm sorry, the opportunity cost of my time is too high. You've lost your calendaring privileges. That was the end of the relationship. So you have to be able to manage a calendar. Finally, we have effective communication. Something that's been very helpful to me is saying out loud, wow, right now I'm feeling a lot of something, even though I think I believe something else. I think I believe that we have a secure relationship, but this is making me feel jealous, or this is making me feel concerned. Let's talk through this and figure out if those feelings are something that's really rational, that's something that's really true, or if it's simply, with the next quote, the idea of the half-life of the autonomic nervous system is at least 30 minutes. This comes from a friend of mine, Don Sutterfeld, here in HCCO. But this concept that once you've been triggered, once you've had something that caused you to feel jealous or insecure or betrayed or whatever, even if you can rationally talk that away, you're still going to have those feelings. You're still going to feel off for at least 30 minutes. And I've had conversations with partners where I've expressly said, yeah, I can't make a decision on this right now. I need time to cool off, and I recognize that I need time to cool off. Something that's also very helpful is having a shared cultural reference or terminology, whether it's Harry Potter or Battlestar Galactica or law, something that you can use as a frame of reference to explore and explain your feelings. It's also important to recognize ways to compromise. I am a planner. I like to have things on the calendar. I have a partner who is very much into spontaneity. She goes to a conference and she wants to have the flexibility to see what develops. And so one of the things that we recognize is this concept of scheduled spontaneity is, okay, this is the time that, she's going to be with Neil, and this other time is whatever works best. And maybe we end up spending the night together, maybe we don't. That's okay. We discuss that as peers, open and honest communication, and then we see what happens. And usually it works out well for all involved. So, the conclusion. Polyamory is hard work. This is hardly surprising because relationships are hard work. But relationships can be wonderful. And polyamory provides a framework by which you can have a variety of relationships and experiences with a variety of wonderful people while simultaneously developing skills that make all of your relationships better. So, thank you very much. I have talked a great deal, so I'm going to sit down and allow you to ask questions that will probably be predominantly answered by my co-presenters. Thank you.